And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Richard Breitman. Richard Breitman is co-author of FDR and the Jews. He received his BA from Yale University and his PhD from Harvard University. He is author or co-author of 10 books and many articles on German history, US history, and the Holocaust. His most recent previous work was Hitler's Shadow, Nazi War Criminals, US Intelligence, and the Cold War, co-authored with Norman J.W. Goda. He's best known for The Architect of Genocide, Himmler and the Final Solution, and Official Secrets, What the Nazis Planned, What the British and Americans Knew. Breitman served as Director of Historical Research for the Nazi War Criminals Records and Imperial Japanese Records Interagency Working Group. He's editor of the scholarly journal Holocaust and Genocide Studies. He teaches courses in modern European history at American University. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Richard Breitman.
Thank you for the generous introduction, and thank you all for coming out. Let me explain that they've got me scheduled for now and again for 3 o'clock. It's not that I really expect any of you to come to both sessions, but it's kind of boring for me to do the same thing twice. So I'm actually doing something different at 3 o'clock. Right now I'm going to give you some sense of how this book came about, give you an overview of the book, and talk about a couple of highlights. And at 3 o'clock, I'm going to do a case study of how Franklin Roosevelt reacted to early news of the Holocaust. So I'll be glad to take questions at the end of this, but the one question I don't want you to ask is, how did Franklin Roosevelt respond to the first news of the Holocaust? Because that's what I'm doing at 3 o'clock. Okay, about 25 years ago, I was doing another book, and I wrote a chapter on Franklin Roosevelt and the Holocaust. I was young then. I had limited experience with the actual operation of government. And I looked hard for sources, but came up with very partial sources about Franklin Roosevelt. So I did the best job I could in that chapter. But at the end, I said to myself, you know, I really didn't get to the bottom of this man, very complicated man. I just didn't know how to do any better. Over the years, I kept my eyes on Franklin Roosevelt. I went on and worked on many other different things. I noted in particular in the late 1990s that the Sumner Welles papers became available. They were donated to this library. And I said to myself, you know, there's probably a lot of good material on Franklin Roosevelt in those papers. But that wasn't quite enough to move me to drop other things I was doing and to turn back to Franklin Roosevelt. I got involved in a project of publishing the diaries and papers of a man named James G. McDonald. Has anybody heard of James G. McDonald? Okay. I'm not surprised. If you had heard of him, you probably would have heard of him in his capacity as the first American ambassador to Israel. But long before that, he was head of the Foreign Policy Association. He was League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees from 1933 to 1935. And he was chairman of President Roosevelt's Advisory Committee on Political Refugees from 1938 to 1945. He kept a diary. The diary was in private hands for many decades. And different pieces of it came together at the Holocaust Museum early in this century. I was brought in to be lead editor. Well, being editor of the first volume was time-consuming, but not a very difficult job because he kept such a marvelous record of events that he was involved in and heard about. And so the first volume from 1932 to 1935 is close to 900 pages. The second volume was a challenge because he stopped keeping a diary in 1936 and didn't start again until 1946, precisely the period of the refugee crisis, the war, the Holocaust. And then we had more diary from 1946 on into the early history of Israel. So we had a gap to fill. And I and the other editors decided that we would do a lot of research in what historians call primary sources, MacDonald's letters, government documents. We were going to synthesize a MacDonald diary from primary sources. In the course of that research, and there is a Roosevelt connection here, in the course of that research, we turned up a conversation that I had known nothing about in spite of all of my previous work on Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt, in April 1938, met with a man named Arthur Sweetser, who was a high-level staff person at the League of Nations. And he was an old colleague of Roosevelt's. Sweetser came in to try to persuade Roosevelt to have the United States do more with the League of Nations. But Roosevelt didn't want to talk about the League of Nations. He wanted to talk about his initiatives on refugees, which really meant Jewish refugees. And Roosevelt told Sweetser that he really wanted to get all the Jews out of Europe. In April 1938. Well, I had never seen anything remotely like that before. And I said, you know, with the MacDonald diaries and the Wells papers and some other sources which had become available, I think it's time for me to go back to Franklin Roosevelt. And my first thought was I would do a book on Roosevelt and the Holocaust, which I was well equipped to do. But when I asked around, I got advice that, look, there are other books on Roosevelt and the Holocaust, or the Holocaust that deal with Roosevelt. You really need to trace Roosevelt from birth until death, and preferably deal with Roosevelt and American Jews, as well as Roosevelt and European Jews. And I said, oi. That's 10 years of work, because it stretched my comfort zone. And then I thought, and I said, you know, what about a co-authored book? I have a friend and colleague and even neighbor who is the best American political historian I know. Why don't I go to him and see if he's willing to do it? So I asked Alan Lichtman if he would work with me on this, and took a little persuading, but not much, and he said yes. And so the book only took us 5 years each. It is different than previous studies because it does deal with Roosevelt from the beginning until the end. It does deal with the Holocaust, but it also deals with what might be called American-Jewish relations and American-Jewish issues. And it's also different than much of the literature in the sense that we found a polarized debate. We found people who were writing that Roosevelt was, in effect, one of the villains of the Holocaust. And we found people who argued that Roosevelt was the best possible president that Jews could ever have hoped for. Well, it didn't take a lot of thought for us to come to the conclusion that both extremes were probably wrong. And Roosevelt was president for a very long time, and conditions changed radically during his presidency. And I already knew from that chapter 25 years ago that Roosevelt's attitudes and priorities evolved over time. They were different in different periods of his presidency. So we tried to get at a nuanced appraisal of Franklin Roosevelt, judging him not just by what seems right to us today in moral terms, but what were the options that people actually talked about at the time? In which period did he raise Jewish issues, and which period did he ignore them or push them off? And we ultimately decided that we could identify 4 phases of Franklin Roosevelt and Jewish issues. The first phase is more or less identical with his first term. He was sympathetic, but not involved. He was, in effect, a bystander because his priority was to get the United States over a horrendous period, the Great Depression, and avoid stirring up social antagonisms in the country which were bad enough already. The irony was that some of his political opponents saw him as an ally of American Jews. He was accused of being too close to the Jews, and the New Deal was described in some quarters as Jewish radicalism. So as far as Nazi persecution of German Jews was concerned, Roosevelt behind the scenes would meet with people and say sympathetic things, but didn't do very much. The second Roosevelt begins very shortly after he was reelected in 1936 and really reaches his height in 1938 and kind of fades off gradually in 1939 as war approached. The second Roosevelt is probably the one you've heard the least about, but that was the Roosevelt that materialized in that conversation with Arthur Schweitzer. Why did Roosevelt change? We have to remember that there had never been a president for more than 2 terms. This was the tradition. And when Roosevelt was reelected in 1936, he undoubtedly thought this was his last term. He had a great record of achievement in domestic policy, and he had done little or nothing in foreign policy, in part because the country was isolationist, the Congress was isolationist, and he was concerned about what was happening in Europe, but he didn't have much opportunity to do anything. But the Nazis were still persecuting Jews. They were beginning to step things up. And we had a fairly substantial immigration quota from Germany, which had never been filled because of State Department regulations. And so foreign policy on refugees was one area where Roosevelt thought he could do something in what he then thought was his last term. It wasn't really to his political advantage to do this. But weeks after his reelection, the State Department sent out a new instruction to consuls in Germany saying, you know, you're not supposed to be barring all immigrants because they might conceivably become public charges. You're only supposed to bar people who are likely to become public charges, likely to go on welfare. And many of these German Jewish applicants are people of good quality, and they have relatives in the United States, and lo and behold, immigration from Germany goes up. And then 1938 was a year of crises. Germany annexed Austria. And Roosevelt decided, well, the Austrian quota is pretty small, but the German quota is pretty large, and Austria and Germany are now one. So let's combine the two quotas. And then all those Austrian Jews have a better chance, and we can fill out the German quota. And then he had that conversation with Sweetser, because Roosevelt thought that very large numbers of Jews should get out of Europe. Millions should get out of Europe. And the United States, he checked, Congress was not going to raise the quota from Germany. The vice president at the time said if Congress could vote in secret, they would vote to cut off all immigration. So Roosevelt figured, well, we'll fill the quota, and we'll try to persuade other countries to take in Jews who would be assets, especially if they can get out with some of their wealth or some of their property. Well, that effort continued really until the start of the war. There's more to say about Kristallnacht and Roosevelt's reaction to Kristallnacht, but I want to save enough time for questions. That was the second Roosevelt. The third Roosevelt comes with the war. And all of the good humanitarian things of the second Roosevelt vanish. Because Roosevelt now is thinking about running again. He is worrying about national security. He is worrying about German espionage and the possibility that the Nazis would insert spies or saboteurs among immigrants coming to the United States. And he is worried about accusations that the Nazis were making every day, and some of the isolationists in this country were making, that Jews were trying to drive the United States into a war. Roosevelt wanted to intervene one way or another against Nazi Germany's enemies, but he wanted the whole country behind him. And so he relied on people whom he trusted rather foolishly to tighten immigration and to do other things to guard himself against attacks that he was endangering the nation. One of them, Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long, was certainly an anti-Semite. But the bigger danger for Roosevelt was that he would lose re-election and the country would head off in a direction that would be indifferent to whatever Germany did in Europe. That Roosevelt was the Roosevelt still there during what we call the Holocaust. And it took a lot to move Roosevelt off that position. It took, in particular, efforts by Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau and his staff to persuade the president that the State Department was systematically mishandling issues with regard to European Jews, and even trying to cut off the flow of information out of Europe about what we call the Holocaust. And at the beginning of 1944, Morgenthau succeeded, and President Roosevelt took jurisdiction away from the State Department and established something called the War Refugee Board. And that last year and a half of the war is what we call the fourth Roosevelt, the Roosevelt who was now willing to do something to save the lives of Jews and others endangered by the Nazis during the war. And we credit the War Refugee Board with helping to save about 200,000 lives. So that is an overview of the book. Now I'm going to conclude with two little stories. You may have further questions about them, but I'm anticipating that there are going to be questions about them because they're the best known stories, and I want to indicate, in effect, what's new in this book on these stories. Many of you have heard the story of the SS St. Louis. All right, let me do a test. How many of the passengers of the St. Louis were sent back to Germany? Okay, I'm getting different answers. All right, but the common answer, those of you who have read The Voyage of the Damned or watched the movie or whatever, is all of them. It's not true. All right. Well, we can talk about this. I'm not going to be able to, the full story is in the book, but let's give a little bit of background and then I'll give you the answer. So the St. Louis was taking Jewish refugees from Germany to Cuba, not to the United States. They had tourist visas to Cuba. Why did they have tourist visas to Cuba? Well, we say, for the first time, because of the Roosevelt administration. On November 11, 1938, Franklin Roosevelt met with Colonel Batista, the predecessor of Castro, in the White House 2 days after the Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And somebody, whether it was Roosevelt or Wells or someone else, indicated to Batista that this refugee initiative was one of the goals of the Roosevelt administration. Well, Batista wanted all kinds of things from the United States. He wanted a better reputation. He wanted a lower tariff on Cuban sugar. He wanted American goodwill. So Batista went off to New York and, lo and behold, gave a speech in which he said that he would be very happy to cooperate with President Roosevelt in his initiative to do something about the terrible situation in Central Europe. And from November 1938 until May 1939, ship after ship left Germany with Jewish refugees going to Cuba on tourist visas, paying heavily for the privilege. By May 1939, there was a pretty good cluster, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 refugees in Havana. And there was a backlash in Cuba. So Batista got conveniently sick. Some other people said, we're going to change this policy. And the passengers of the St. Louis were largely not allowed to land. 22 of them had Cuban immigration visas. They were allowed in. But 940 odd others had those tourist visas, and they were turned away, and the ship was turned away. There were negotiations for days. The German captain of the ship began to sail around, including on the coast of Florida. There is a story which some of the surviving St. Louis passengers still believe, that the Coast Guard was there to prevent them from landing in the United States. The Coast Guard had no such orders. If they had landed in the United States, they couldn't have stayed because they had no visas. The immigration quota was then filled. There was a backlog, a waiting list of 300,000 people. The whole reason for their going to Cuba was to be somewhere safe while they waited their turn for American immigration visas. Could Roosevelt have admitted them as some kind of emergency measure? Not legally, but he might have tried to get away with it. And what would the consequences have been? Roosevelt's highest foreign policy priority then was to amend the Neutrality Acts that prevented him from aiding any country involved in a war in Europe. There were a host of Southern Democratic congressmen, senators whose votes he needed. They were all anti-immigration, and some of them were anti-Semitic. So if he had decided to admit the passengers of the St. Louis to the United States, he probably would have paid a price for it, and we might be looking at a very different history of World War II. But whether you agree with that determination or not, there's one thing that you have to take away from this book. They didn't go back to Germany. There were negotiations involving the Joint Distribution Committee and the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees and the State Department, and in the end, Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands took all the passengers of the St. Louis. This was before the war. This was before the Holocaust. This was a perfectly good solution at the time. Only in retrospect did the defect become clear with German conquests. And in the end, nearly 1/3 of the passengers died one way or another of the Holocaust, but more than 2/3 survived, and half of them ultimately ended up in the United States. So we don't insist that you take our judgment of Roosevelt's decisions or non-decisions in this instance or in many other instances throughout the book. We simply want you to make your judgments based on what really happened and not on distortions or myths. I think I'm about out of time, so I'm going to stop with that one, and I know what you're going to ask about, the other one that I would have covered, but I'll wait for the questions.
To stay off of FDR, could you comment on Felix Frankfurter and how a lot of very prominent Jewish Americans, not FDR, dealt with their moral crises? Some of them would not speak out about the issue through the 30s and even later. And anything you would divulge about that whole topic at this time?
Well, American Jews were, you'll be surprised to hear, divided then, even more divided than they are now. Sort of one line of division was between the kind of conservative establishment Jews, not conservative in terms of Republican, but conservative in terms of lifestyle and culture, centered in the American Jewish Committee and the pro-Zionists in the American Jewish Congress, who were much more willing to mount demonstrations. And then during the war, there was a third category led by a Palestinian Jew named Peter Bergson, even more willing to make a splash in newspaper advertisements and demonstrations and pageants and so forth. There was a substantial level of anti-Semitism in the United States. And the more conservative American Jews were always worried about initiatives that would backfire. The American Jewish Congress people were more willing to take risks, and the Bergson people were even more willing to take risks, whatever the reaction. So that's a very quick response to that question. As far as Frankfurter is concerned, of course, he was appointed to the Supreme Court in 1939. He said nothing publicly after that. He met frequently with Franklin Roosevelt, and it's quite possible that in 1942 or later they discussed what we call the Holocaust, but there's no record of it. Very hard to say what transpired.
In my college lecture, my name was cast President on disability. Whatever happened to him after the war refugee board?
Question was about what happened to Breckinridge Long afterwards. He served briefly in the State Department after the beginning of 1944, ultimately retired, became a director of Laurel Raceway outside Washington, D.C., where I wrote, he oversaw thoroughbreds. Yes?
Just before we came here, in the library on display, Roosevelt and the Holocaust, there's a letter from Rabbi Weiss listing the number of Jews who died in all the various countries. What was Roosevelt's response to that letter?
You know, I haven't seen the new exhibit yet, so can you give me the date of the letter?
That's the only part. I just haven't seen your moment here. I was just reading the numbers here. Somebody from Romania here.
Okay.
From Bulgaria.
This is probably among the material given to President Roosevelt on December 8th, 1942, when there was a meeting in the Oval Office about what we call the Holocaust. And there was this is part of my 3 o'clock presentation, so I'm not going to go into great detail, but there was an Allied declaration issued on December 17th, 1942, that was the first official Allied recognition of Nazi policy of exterminating the Jewish people. So there was a reaction to it, but it was not an aggressive or personal reaction by Franklin Roosevelt, who did not speak out directly against the Holocaust personally until 1944. Yes?
Could you comment on Eleanor Roosevelt's views towards the Jews and her involvement in the opposition to the Holocaust?
The question was about Eleanor Roosevelt, and I am reassured by having spoken with Alida Black, who was speaking on Eleanor Roosevelt, and she said she agrees with our treatment of Franklin and Eleanor. People kind of project Eleanor Roosevelt backwards, and they know that Eleanor Roosevelt from the post-World War II period, and they assume that she was always exactly that way, and she wasn't. She was raised in a family that was anti-Semitic, and she came out as a young woman with anti-Semitic prejudices, and you can see that in some of her letters. She gradually grew out of it. But she was never an aggressive champion of Jewish refugees during the Holocaust. The one issue on which she took a position in advance of her husband was about a bill to expand the quota by admitting 20,000 German Jewish children. She was always big on children, and so this was not a big stretch for her. But, you know, she wrote a daily column, and she never raised Nazi persecution of the Jews until 1943. And when she did on that occasion, she said, "I don't really know what we can do except win the war as quickly as possible." And that was the official line then, and it was the line that the Treasury Department people fought against, and it was the line that the War Refugee Board ultimately said is wrong. We got to try to do some other things, even if they're not military things, to save people's lives. Yes? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
What about Eleanor's stance on the boundary of Israel?
Yeah, Eleanor, after the war, became a big champion of the state of Israel, and in fact, she was in the UN delegation that played a critical role in authorizing the establishment of Israel. But that's post-war. Yes?
Has anybody, did you or has anybody else talked about the other people who were like being targeted by the Nazis and helping them get out, like the gypsies and the communists and all the, there was 7 million of them also that died in concentration camps.
Okay, the question was about other categories of people targeted by the Nazis, and was anybody doing anything? The mission of the War Refugee Board was not specifically save just the Jews, but to save anyone victimized by persecution of the Nazi regime. In practice, very hard to identify other categories. Yes, they could have identified Sinti and Romani victims in the camps, but how do you get them out of the camps? And others were in hiding or widely dispersed. So in practice, the War Refugee Board largely concentrated on potential Jewish victims. Yes?
You mentioned at the beginning of your lecture the polarized nature of this subject and the misinformation you mentioned, throughout your lecture. Why do you think, even especially among academic historians, that this topic has become so rife with misinformation and, lack of good academic practices?
Why are there so many myths or distortions or wrong beliefs? Well, some of it is just, the Holocaust speaks to us. And the Holocaust was a terrible tragedy, and people feel the pain to the present day. And you want to look back and identify ways in which things could have been different. And it doesn't do any good these days to say, well, Adolf Hitler was a monster, or Heinrich Himmler, ran the SS and the concentration camps, and these people are beyond blaming. So when people look for lessons, they tend to look for lessons in the democracies and not in Nazi Germany or in German culture. Yes, there was in the 90s a book kind of blaming German culture for the Holocaust, and it was a bestseller for a while, but it kind of faded in academic terms. So I think the issue of morality during genocide is something that is a recurring issue, and the notion of standing by and not doing things is something that bothers people, and then they go back and they project based on the incorrect story of the St. Louis or an at least highly questionable story about the bombing or non-bombing of Auschwitz, which was the other case I was going to talk about. Again, you really have to read the details in the book, but I will say this. I got an email from somebody after the book came out who said, how much of this can I say? Well, let me do it this way. He said he had been at a dinner party with a famous Holocaust survivor. I'm not going to name the man, but he has a Nobel Prize. And he came away with the following story. This survivor was invited to the White House in the 1970s, and the President, Carter, went to his safe and pulled out a set of photos and documents showing the gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And this was material that the United States had during the war in 1943, and Roosevelt knew all about it and did nothing. So I wrote to this guy. The United States in 1943 could not get any planes anywhere near Auschwitz-Birkenau. That first became possible in the middle of 1944. There were bombings carried on in the second half of 1944 of industrial targets in Silesia. And on one occasion, one plane accidentally dropped a bomb in the general area of the camp. And of course, they took reconnaissance photos of the targets, but nobody had ever planned careful reconnaissance of the camp. The photos that were taken accidentally of camp facilities were ignored for decades and magnified by the CIA in the 1970s. And lo and behold, somebody then said, hey, this shows the gas chamber crematoria at Auschwitz. And the CIA photo analyst, the man who was the most expert in the world, wrote an article about why Allied photo analysts failed to identify the gas chambers and crematoria during the war. So that doesn't exhaust the issue of bombing Auschwitz, but it shows the kind of misinformation which circulates when people are not careful and when they let their moral sensibilities overwhelm their historical judgment. Yes.
You're saying they had the photo, but they didn't know what it was?
They did not know what it was, and they didn't even probably have the tools to magnify it enough to see the gas chambers and crematoria in the second half of 1944. No. Okay. Thank you very much.